This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we open a file that was never meant to be found. It begins quietly, the way most human disasters do with a house, a mound, a family, and a truth that sat in plain sight for generations, while the rest of the world chose not to see it. The region was isolated, forgotten by maps long before the people living there were forgotten by each other. A place where the same last names reappeared every 20 or 30 years, drifting through birth certificates like echoes. A place where bloodlines didn't branch outward, they folded in, again and again, circling themselves like a noose tied gently over decades. The house at the center of this story sat at the end of a gravel road that wasn't really a road anymore, just a suggestion of one. The trees swallowed each side like they were reclaiming something taken from them. And the house, they always describe it the same way, not broken, not collapsed, not abandoned. Sleeping, old wood, with a kind of sagging patience, windows fogged with age, paint flaking like dry skin, a place that looked less built and more grown, as if the earth had pushed it upward as an afterthought. Inside lived the family, people who had been spoken of quietly for decades, a clan with a reputation whispered rather than explained. They were said to be kind, simple, private, strange in ways that were never fully named, the type of family that stayed to themselves, not because they feared the world, but because the world feared what it might see if it stepped too close. For years, nothing happened there that anyone outside the valley noticed. Children were born, seasons passed, illness moved through households like a slow, inevitable wind. People aged quickly there, or they didn't age at all, at least not in the way you expect. The valley tolerated it the way rural regions tolerate anything, by pretending it isn't happening. And then outsiders arrived, documentarians, journalists, people who came because the modern world has a hunger for what it calls authenticity, never realizing that authenticity is often just trauma with the paint scraped off. They wanted to see the family themselves. They wanted footage, interviews, a story that could be consumed, edited, packaged, and presented. What they found was something different, something no one had prepared them for. The house didn't resist them. It welcomed them the way an old wound welcomes pressure. And inside, the family moved through the rooms with a rhythm that can only come from long dependence, steps timed around each other, voices overlapping, gestures repeated so many times they became symbolic. Some members communicated in grunts or single syllables. Others rocked back and forth, eyes drifting, hands tapping their own chests, like they were trying to feel whether their heart was still inside. One of them made a sound like a low barca habit, learned from decades of growing up near stray dogs, or perhaps something deeper, something learned in a place where language had eroded faster than memory. The documentarian wrote in his notes that the house felt like a place where time had thinned, not by years but by neglect, as if the walls remembered more than the people living inside them. He spent hours there, days, long enough for the artificial curiosity to dissolve, and for something more honest and much more disturbing to replace it. He watched how one brother followed another through the halls with obedient precision, as if shadowing him was a lifelong instinct. He watched how one of the sisters smiled with an expression that never reached her eyes, a smile that seemed pasted on, copied from someone she once saw, performed rather than felt. and he watched the oldest member of the family stare out the window for nearly an hour, unmoving, silent, eyes unfocused, as if watching something in the yard that the documentarian could not see. There were moments when the house fell into a stillness so complete that the man holding the camera felt the urge to whisper, not out of respect, but out of fear, that the house might respond. The truth began to unravel in fragments. A cousin who lived 2 counties away said the family had been like this forever. A local store clerk said no one taught their children to read because no one in the household had ever needed to. A former neighbor claimed he once heard shouting from the property, not a fight, but the sound of several voices speaking the same phrase at once, in a tone that reminded him of prayer or panic. And someone else, much older, said something that clung to the documentarian's mind long after he left. They aren't bad people. They just didn't get the chance to become anything else. That should have been the end of it. A glimpse into a forgotten piece of America. A sad story. A complicated story. A story about poverty and isolation and generational harm. But the deeper the documentarian looked, the more the story looked back. It wasn't just the family's appearance. It wasn't just the way they moved. It wasn't even the sounds they made. It was the feeling that the family had been shaped by something more than genetics, something environmental, something psychological, something placed upon them. Because some members of the family behaved in ways that didn't seem like instinct or disorder, but like adaptation responses learned over generations to survive something unspoken. The house, the valley, each other. The truth, that quiet, patient truth, began to settle over the documentarian like dust. This family was not simply an accident of biology. They were the product of a system, a cycle, a lineage that had folded in on itself so many times that it no longer resembled the world outside. And something was still holding it together. Something invisible, something heavy. Something the documentarian could feel every time he stepped out of the house and realized the air outside was easier to breathe. Whatever lived in that house, whatever shaped that family, was not finished. Not yet. The documentarian returned the next morning with fresh batteries, extra film, and a notebook he didn't remember packing. Not because he had forgotten, but because the house had already begun rearranging his memory in small, delicate ways. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself the valley air was heavy. He told himself there was nothing supernatural about a place that simply made him uncomfortable. But discomfort has a pattern, and the deeper he went into the Elbridge home, the more that pattern tightened around him. He realized it as soon as he stepped inside. The family did not behave like individuals. They behaved like parts of a single organism. When one member shifted their weight, another copied the motion seconds later. When someone scratched their arm, another scratched the same spot on their own body, not consciously, not purposefully, but like a reflex. He watched 3 siblings sit together on a sagging couch, each making the same rhythmic rocking motion, not synchronized perfectly, but close enough to feel intentional. Close enough to feel learned. One of them, a man with broad shoulders and a face turned inward, barked suddenly, a single sharp sound. The others didn't startle. They didn't react at all. The bark wasn't communication. It was punctuation, a sound the house absorbed as naturally as breath. When the documentarian reviewed that footage years later, he would notice something he didn't see in the moment. Every time one of the family members barked, the camera shook ever so slightly, as if the house itself exhaled. He spent hours interviewing each person, though interviewing is a generous word. Some answered questions with one-word responses. Some only laughed a soft, airy sound that felt borrowed. Some made noises that veered towards language, but never quite became it. The eldest Sistera woman with deep-set eyes and a slow, swaying posture held his hand for a moment, then placed it gently on her own throat, as if inviting him to feel something moving beneath her skin. He pulled away. She didn't frown. She didn't react at all. Her hand simply dropped, fingers twitching in a small, repetitive motion, as if counting something silently. The youngest brother refused to speak entirely. Instead, he paced. Small circles, large circles, tight spirals, counterclockwise loops. He traced paths, worn into the carpet, loops that had been followed so often. The fibers had flattened into permanent trails. When the documentarian mapped them later, he realized the spirals matched the exact geographic pattern of the gravel road leading to the house. A perfect reflection of his environment, beaten into him through years of walking the same looping path. At one point, the documentarian asked the family about their parents. The room went silent, completely, utterly. A suffocating stillness. The rocking stopped. The swaying stopped. Even the pacing halted mid-step. Not because they were afraid, but because the question didn't exist in their vocabulary. There was no concept of parents in a household where roles had dissolved decades ago. There were only connections, shapes, echoes. Not a family tree, a family circle, a closed system, self-feeding, self-repeating, self-sustaining. The documentarian began noticing details he had overlooked. Every doorframe had gouges, scratches from nails, some fresh, some decades old, marks from generations of hands, testing boundaries they never had the freedom to cross. The kitchen window was covered by plywood, not from neglect, but from intent. The screws were new. The wood had been replaced recently, as if someone wanted the outside world to become permanently hypothetical. And the fridge, something as mundane as a refrigerator, told one of the darkest stories of all. It contained only 3 items: a gallon of milk, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a jar with no label. Inside the jar was a thick, pale substance. Not paint, not food. Something viscous, something mixed, something wrong. When asked what it was, the middle brother smiled, a serene, almost angelic expression, and whispered, "For the growing." He never explained. No one else would. That night, the documentarian slept in his car. Not because he feared the family, but because he feared what he was beginning to understand. This wasn't simply inbreeding. This wasn't simply neglect. This wasn't simply isolation. This was a generational structure designed to collapse the boundaries between individuals until the family functioned as a single living memory, a memory that adapted, a memory that protected itself, a memory that kept out the world and kept itself intact. But the most chilling moment didn't happen inside the house. It happened at dusk, when the documentarian walked behind the property to film the woods. He heard footsteps. Not one set, not two, several, soft, barefoot, light as dust. When he turned, the entire family was standing behind him, not threateningly, not angrily, but unified. Heads slightly tilted, breath synchronized, eyes reflecting the last light of the evening, like animals that learned long ago not to blink until the danger passed. The eldest sister stepped forward. She lifted a hand, not to touch him, but to point. At the woods, at the dark, at something unseen. Something the documentarian had not yet realized was part of their story because someone else lived out there. Someone the family still responded to. Someone who didn't appear on camera, but left traces everywhere. Broken twigs in patterns, circles of stones, a faint tapping on windows at night. A presence that didn't belong to the modern world or the old one. A presence the family recognized but never named. The woods behind the house were not an afterthought. They were part of the system and extension of the home, a secondary womb where something had been growing, quietly, secretly, for years. The documentarian stepped past the sagging back porch, the smell of damp soil rising in a slow wave. Night wasn't fully settled yet, but the light had thinned enough that every tree looked like it was leaning toward him, listening. He told himself he was only filming scenery, atmosphere, cutaway shots. But the family had followed him to the tree line of them, and none would cross it. That should have been enough of a warning. The oldest sister remained closest. Her hand stayed raised, still pointing into the forest, still directing his attention toward something she refused to name. Her face wasn't fearful. It was reverent, like someone gesturing toward a grave or an altar. He aimed his camera toward the woods. The lens adjusted. The autofocus twitched. The trees blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again, as if something was interfering, just beyond visible range. A sound drifted out then, soft, not an animal, not wind. A tapping, rhythmic, measured, as if someone were hitting two pieces of wood together in a slow, considered pattern. Tap, 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 tap. The documentarian scanned the tree trunks. Nothing. Tap, tap, tap. It continued, even when he moved, even when he held his breath. Then he realized something. The tapping wasn't around him. It was following him. He walked deeper into the woods, branches dragging across his jacket like fingers. The tapping grew louder, but never changed directional ways behind him, always exactly the length of 10 steps away, as if something walked just out of sight, mimicking his pace, with absolute precision. He stopped. The tapping stopped. He took one slow step forward. The response came immediately, one sharp tap. Perfectly timed. He whispered into his recorder, "Someone's out here." But that wasn't correct. The truth was colder. Something was out here. The family made no sound behind him. When he turned, they were gone, not dispersed. Gone. He had been in the woods for less than a minute, yet the entire household had vanished, without footsteps, without voices, without the creaking boards of the porch. They had retreated the moment he stepped into the forest, as if they knew the woods were not meant for outsiders or for them. Only for one. The tapping resumed, closer. He swung the camera left and froze. Between two bowed trees, half hidden in the shadow, something moved. Not a person, not an animal. Something upright, but slouched, as if its spine had learned the wrong shape. The movement didn't match footsteps. It glided, jerking every few feet, like someone remembering how to walk after too long in the dark. The tap, tap, tap now came from its hands, two sticks struck together, held low near the hips. Not a warning. A signal. The documentarian whispered again. There's another one. But the family hadn't mentioned another one. They had never said anything about the woods. They hadn't needed to. Every instinct in his body told him he was looking at someone related to the people in the house, but not raised there. Not cared for, not sheltered, abandoned, hidden, left to grow in the forest, the way mold grows when you close a room for too long. His camera caught a brief glimpse as the figure stepped forward, bare feet caked with soil, long toes that gripped the earth like claws, legs bowed outward, knees bending at angles that suggested walking had once been optional, arms ending in hands that twitched and fluttered, as if grasping at invisible threads, and a face, no, not a face. A mask of features arranged in the right general shape, but pulled too tight, as if someone had pressed wet clay over the skull of a person without knowing what a human should look like. The eyes were wide, too wide, round and searching, reflecting the camera's light like an animal's. It stared at him, without blinking, without breathing. When he finally stepped backward, the figure mimicked him on step, same pace, same angle, not approaching, mirroring, the same way the family mirrored each other. Only this one did it imperfectly, like a reflection in a warped sheet of metal. He whispered, "Who are you?" It tilted its head so far, the vertebrae cracked audibly. Tap, 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 tap. Then it opened its mouth. The sound that came out was not speech. It was not a grunt or a bark or anything the family inside the house made. It was something else, a breathy, high-pitched attempt at a word, learned by listening through windows and walls and decades of distance. It said, "Fa, mi, li." The documentarian ran. Branches tore his jacket. Roots grabbed his ankles. The tapping chased him for a time, then disappeared suddenly, cut off mid-beat, as if the forest itself swallowed it. When he reached the yard, gasping, the family stood waiting, all of them, silent, eyes locked on him, no one speaking, no one moving. Then the eldest sister walked forward and placed her hand on his chest, a gesture that meant, "You saw what we aren't supposed to acknowledge." Behind her, the brother who barked once let out a low, soft sound, a sound the documentarian later understood as mourning. Because the figure in the woods was not a stranger. It was part of the family, a branch of the lineage kept apart not by choice, but by necessity, a child the house had refused to contain, but the forest had accepted. The missing one, the forgotten one, the lost axis of their bloodline. The one person who knew the family before they became what they are now. The one who grew up, without walls, to shape the mind. The one who learned to walk by watching animals. The The one who learned to speak by listening through cracks. The one the family never talked about. The family did not speak of the figure in the woods. They didn't warn him. They didn't explain. They simply watched him recover his breath, watched him wipe dirt from his hands, watched the tremor settling in his voice, and understood immediately that he had crossed a threshold they had spent decades trying to protect. The eldest sister, the one with the unmoving eyes and the gentle sway, lowered her hand from his chest and took a single step backward, not out of fear, out of respect. He was no longer an outsider. He was now someone who had seen what their family only survived by forgetting. The documentarian scanned their faces, the rocking, the twitching, the subtle copying of motions, and realized something was missing. Not someone. Something. A presence that had been with them the entire time. A quiet sentinel he hadn't been able to name. It was the absence of a figure at the center of the family's formation. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line. There should be another one. The oldest brother approached, barefoot, shuffling, hands at his sides, but fingers twitching as if pulling at invisible cords. He tapped his chest twice, and then pointed toward the woods. The gesture wasn't random. It was too deliberate, too ritualistic. The documentarian asked, was he born out there, in the woods? The brother tilted his head, then looked at the ground, then made a sound like a short, clipped whiner sound that carried more grief than language ever could. The documentarian understood. The figure in the woods had not been abandoned. He had been removed, separated at the moment of birth, by someone or something that believed he could not survive inside the house. Or worse, that the house could not survive him. The eldest sister took his sleeve gently and guided him back inside. Not forcefully, not even urgently, more like someone leading a guest into a room they needed to see before making a decision. The living room was dim. Late afternoon sunlight pressed through the curtains like weak breath. The family gathered around him, a wordless circle of eyes, postures, and mirrored breathing patterns. Then the oldest brother walked to the corner of the room and knelt beside a chest of drawers the documentarian hadn't noticed before. The drawer slid open, with the sound of wood that had swollen from humidity a damp groan. Inside were objects, stacked neatly. A pair of worn children's shoes, black with age, a frayed blanket, a tiny carved stick, smooth from years of handling, and a single photograph, yellowed, creased, handled too often. The brother lifted it and held it to the documentarian. It showed a newborn child, wrapped in a thin cloth, held by a woman with hollow cheeks and eyes that stared past the camera, with a look of deep, immutable acceptance. The child's legs were bent oddly. The arms curled tight against the chest, and the fingers, even in infancy, were elongated, curling as though reaching for something unseen. The documentarian whispered, "This is him." The sister nodded. Her hand traced a small circle in the air, as if indicating a repeating cycle. A loop. A tradition. A mistake they could never correct. He asked the question quietly. Why was he taken to the woods? The room fell into its familiar stillness, the kind that felt less like silence, and more like a shared memory being stirred. Then the middle brother, the one who had smiled, with that pasted-on grin earlier, leaned close and tapped the documentarian's wrist 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The same pattern the figure in the woods used. The house wasn't protecting them from him. They were imitating him, copying him, learning from him. He wasn't an outcast. He was the origin. The first one to show the behaviors. The family later mirrored imperfectly behaviors born from isolation, from genetic repetition, from instincts that had sharpened over generations. But why the woods? Why separate him from the family? The answer arrived not from the house, nor from the siblings, but from a clue so subtle the documentarian nearly missed it. On the back of the photograph was a date, a month, a year, and a symbol, a circle, cut by a single line, the same symbol carved into trees around the property. The same symbol etched into the stone near the creek bed. The same symbol he had seen painted faintly on the underside of the porch steps. A boundary mark, not for humans, for him. The eldest sister broke the silence with a gesture, 2 hands forming a cradle, then opening like a release. They had not put him in the woods because he was dangerous. They placed him there because the house could not contain what his mind would become. He was not wild, not feral, not insane. He was the purest expression of what the family lineage had been shaping for over a century. A mind adapted to isolation, that needed even more isolation. A mind that could not be contained indoors because confinement would collapse it into something broken. His environment was his structure. Remove him from the forest, and he would die. Remove the forest, and he would unravel. He was not a mistake. He was an outcome, a final product. The documentarian felt the room's weight settle. The family inside the house were copies of him slowly, imperfectly, trying to match the instincts of the one who had been shaped correctly by the environment the lineage was built for. They weren't avoiding the figure in the woods. They were honoring him, protecting his distance, maintaining the cycle, a cycle older than any person still living. The documentarian stepped outside again and looked into the forest, and for a moment, just a flicker, he saw movement, not approaching, not stalking, not threatening, watching, waiting. As if the figure knew his part of the story was about to unfold. The documentarian didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the photograph, the infant with the bent limbs, the curling fingers, the forest behind him like a second womb. He saw the symbol-tooth circle cut by a single linear shape that felt less like a drawing and more like a sentence, a boundary, a separation, a warning. But warnings don't come from nowhere. They are born from events, an origin, a moment when everything shifted. And the deeper he searched through the family's history, through courthouse records, through cemetery plots, through faded county documents that had survived more floods than generations, the closer he came to the original fracture that split the bloodline into 2 branches, the ones who lived in the house and the one who lived in the woods. The origin wasn't merely an accident of birth. It was a decision made by a man whose name the valley had erased as completely as the forest had hidden his remains. His name was Elijah Elbridge. The first generation, the beginning of the line. He appears in records as only once in an 1892 census, where his age was listed as unknown, and his occupation as none. The census taker had written one additional note in the margin beside his name, claims he cannot leave the woods. It was easy to dismiss that line as madness, ignorance, or superstition, until the documentarian found a second record, a police ledger from 1893, handwritten, water damaged, half the ink erased. But one entry remained clear. Elijah Elbridge, delivered infant to county officer. State's child must not be raised indoors. Refused to enter station. Would only communicate through window. The child's name was never recorded, because Elijah refused to give one. He simply left the infant wrapped in a blanket, placed beside the station door, and then disappeared, back into the tree line, with the silent certainty of an animal returning to its den. That alone was strange. But what came next was stranger. The infant was placed into a county home, fed, bathed, cared for. For 3 days, nothing seemed unusual. On the 4th day, the child began refusing food. By the 6th, its skin had turned a pale, sickly gray. By the 8th, its eyes had stopped tracking light. Doctors couldn't determine the cause. They tried formulas. They tried warmth. They tried everything they had. But the child continued to deteriorate, until one nurse-a-woman named Marjorie Clayton made a strange decision. She carried the infant outside, into the sunlight. The baby's breathing shifted immediately from ragged gasps to a long, steady rhythm. Marjorie stayed with the child the entire afternoon, moving with the sunlight as the shadows changed. When she came inside, the baby began to cry uncontrollably. She stepped outside again. The crying stopped. Within 3 days, the child was healthy. Doctors wrote in the report, "Responds to natural environment." A meaningless phrase, a guess. But Elijah, the father, returned on the 9th day, not to reclaim the child, but to warn them. He approached the county home at dusk, kept his distance, and whispered to Marjorie through the window, "He's not meant for rooms. Rooms twist the mind. The forest straightens it." Marjorie asked him what that meant. He only said, "I'm trying to break the cycle. Let him grow the right way." The right way. A phrase Marjorie recorded because she didn't understand it. But the documentarian did. The right way was the forest. The cycle was the lineage's collapse, inward the folding of generations. That had begun long before Elijah's birth. Something in their blood had always pulled them away from the world toward isolation, toward retreat, toward instinct over language, environment over structure. Elijah had tried to fix it by separating one child from the rest, by choosing one line to live in houses and one to live in the woods. A split designed to preserve something he feared would otherwise destroy them all. And he marked the boundaries with the symbol, the circle with the single line, a border. Not between land and land, but between mind and mind. It meant, do not cross this way unless you can survive it. But surviving the forest came with a price. Isolation shapes the brain, like a sculptor shapes clay. Slowly, endlessly, invisibly. The child. Elijah delivered the first forest child, grew with instincts sharpened by space and silence and disconnection. His descendants learned to walk by imitating leaves moving in the wind. They learned to speak by howling storms and scraping branches. They learned to think, not in language, but in patterns. Tap, 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 tap. A language born from distance, a dialect of isolation. When the documentarian finally pieced together that history, the air in his car felt thin as he sat with the old records spread across his lap. He understood now why the family inside the house mirrored each other. They were incomplete copies of the original pattern, a diluted form of something much stronger. They could survive indoors because their minds had weakened, over generations weakened enough to adapt to walls and rules and artificial structure. But the true bloodline, the one Elijah tried to preserve, could not. Rooms twisted the mind, walls crushed it. The house was never a refuge. It was a compromise. And the forest was the only place where the original pattern could grow without breaking. That night, as the documentarian sat in his car, with the engine off, and the woods stretching out like a vast watching presence, he heard it again. Tap. Tap, tap, tap. Closer. Not a warning. An invitation. The documentarian had spent days circling the edges of this truth. Now he had reached the center, and the center was calling him. The tapping outside his car window was softer tonight. Measured. Gentle. Not a threat. Not a warning. A summons. He opened the door slowly, as if afraid the forest would recoil. But the forest did not move. It simply received him. He stepped onto the gravel, and the night swallowed the sound of his footsteps, as though absorbing them, as though this place had been waiting for someone to make the choice no member of the house had ever made, to enter the woods voluntarily. He walked past the sagging fence and into the region where the symbol, the circle, divided by a line, was carved into trees in angles and heights that suggested generations of hands had marked the boundary again and again. Each line looked slightly different, some carved deep, some barely scratched, some traced by hands that shook, others by hands that knew exactly how the mark was meant to be drawn. The symbol was not a warning to outsiders. It was a promise to someone inside. He crossed the boundary. The air changed immediately, colder, cleaner. The scent of rot and wet bark mingled with something faintly sweet a smell he recognized only from the childhood memory of visiting old barns with his grandfather. The smell of things lived in by creatures you never see. He looked back only once. The house stood in the clearing, dark windows reflecting nothing, the family silhouettes still visible behind the glass, watching, waiting, holding their breath. They knew what he was about to learn. The tapping resumed, to his left, steady and patient. He followed it. The deeper he moved into the woods, the more he realized these trees were not wild. They had grown around patterns, clearings shaped like rings, paths worn into spirals, roots twisted into symbols that matched the marks carved into bark. A forest shaped by minds that had shaped themselves to fit the forest. The tapping grew louder. Tap, 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 tap. Then it stopped. Not abruptly, not sharply. It faded, as if the one making it had become aware that he was close enough to hear something else. Breathing. Soft. Steady. Human. But not the breathing of someone afraid. The breathing of someone who had been waiting. He turned his camera on. The light flickered over branches, roots, the dark ground, until it caught something pale. A hand, thin, long, resting on the moss-covered trunk of a fallen tree, like the forest's own spine. The figure stepped into view, with no hesitation. It was the same one he had seen earlier, the warped posture, the elongated limbs, the wide, reflective eyes. But now, in the glow of the camera, he saw something he had not noticed before. Scars. Circular scars around the wrists, as if ropes had once held him in place, for reasons that were not punishment, but protection. More scars around the ankles, in matching patterns, symmetrical, deliberate. The documentarian whispered, "You are kept here." The figure blinked slowly, then pressed both palms to the ground and lowered its head, as if demonstrating a posture it had learned long ago. Submission, containment, boundary. He knelt to not out of fear, but because the moment demanded it. Then he heard it. Not from the figure. From deeper in the woods. Another tap. This one lower. Slower. More deliberate. A second pattern responded. Tap, tap, tap. The figure before him shuddered, not in fear, but recognition. A recognition that vibrated through its bones. There was more than one. The forest child was not the last. He was the first of a new generation the forest had shaped. The documentarian whispered, "There are others." The figure tilted its head and made a sound, a soft, breathy exhale that almost resembled a word. More. The second tapping grew closer. A third joined it, distant, high-pitched, then a fourth, a chorus of coded signals from unseen mouths and hands. The documentarian felt the realization take root with a cold, inevitable certainty. Elijah's attempt to split the bloodline had not merely preserved the cycle. It had accelerated it. Each forest child had grown stronger instincts, sharper senses, more adaptive traits, and each generation required less human structure and more natural space to develop correctly. The house lineage was slowing, weakening, diluting into patterns of repetition. But the forest lineage, the one created from deprivation, instinctive copying, and environmental shaping, had gained momentum. The tapping surrounded him now, not threatening, calling. The figure stepped closer and placed a long, bony finger against the documentarian's chest, exactly where the eldest sister had touched earlier that day. The same gesture, the same message. You crossed the boundary. Now you must understand why. Another figure appeared at the edge of the trees shorter, moving with a cautious, almost childlike gait. Then another, taller, leaner, eyes glowing faintly in the camera's light. By the time the documentarian realized he was surrounded, the tapping had ceased. Silence. Not empty. Anticipatory. The first forest child stepped aside, making space, inviting him deeper, into the place where Elijah first brought a newborn, to break the lineage into two paths, one destined for collapse in walls, one destined for survival in shadows. He raised his camera, not as protection, as documentation, because sometimes filming something is the only way to keep your mind from breaking. He stepped forward, and the forest closed behind him with the quiet finality of a door gently shutting. The forest closed behind him, and for the first time, the documentarian understood why Elijah drew the boundary mark so carefully. It wasn't meant to keep the forest child out of the house. It was meant to keep everyone else out of here. He moved through the trees, surrounded by shapes that kept to his edges, half-lit figures with the same wide eyes, the same quiet steps, the same instinctive mirroring, not malicious, not feral, not lost, aligned. They guided him toward a slope of earth that looked at first like a natural hill until he saw the symmetry, a depression in the soil. A circular impression, a pattern too perfect for wind or time. A foundation, the foundation of Elijah's original home. Long before the modern family house stood in the clearing, Elijah had lived here alone, or so the valley believed. But the forest children led the documentarian past the remains of stone and into a narrow space he never would have noticed. A hollow under the earth. A chamber, small, silent, empty, except for a single wooden box resting on the dirt floor. The forest children knelt around it, heads bowed, hands twitching in rhythmic pulses. He approached. The box was open. Inside lay a stack of notebooks, each marked on the first page with the symbol, circle, single line. Elijah's handwriting filled every pagino, rambling, not delusional, but precise. He documented everything. The lineage, the genetic decline. The children who thrived only outdoors, the ones who collapsed indoors, the instinctive patterns, the mirroring behavior, the tapping code, the environmental shaping. He recorded the moment. He realized the truth. The ridge does not harm us. The ridge creates us. The documentarian turned the page. Indoor life disrupts the pattern. Outdoor life completes it. Brains shaped by open space collapse in confinement. Another page. One child must always remain in the forest. One must always remain in the house. Two branches, two paths, balance. A final line. If the system breaks, the family dies with it. The forest children stared at him with expectant stillness. He understood now. The figure he saw first was this generation's forest keeper, the one Elijah meant to preserve, the one the house was designed to mimic, though imperfectly. The woods were not accidental. They were the second half of the family's mind, the external part, the place where instincts stayed sharp. The house children lived slow, repeating lives because they functioned as memory. The forest children lived feral, pattern-driven lives because they functioned as instinct. Elijah had built a system to keep both halves alive, and by documenting them, by filming them, by learning their patterns, the documentarian had crossed a line he didn't realize existed. He became a witness. But worse, he became a variable. Because Elijah's final entry said, when the cycle is threatened, introduce new blood. Train it by exposure. A mind that studies the system can become part of it. The documentarian froze. The forest children watched, silent, waiting. as if he were their newest memory, their next pattern, their next bridge between worlds. He stepped back, heart pounding. But the first forest child held out a Honda simple gesture, gentle, almost human, not to capture him, not to restrain him, to welcome him. The house children had watched him from behind windows. The forest children had followed him through branches. Both halves had already accepted his presence. He had entered the cycle. He had learned the pattern. He had crossed the boundary. And Elijah's notes were clear. The moment you cross, you do not come back the same. He ran, not from danger, from inclusion. Branches tore his sleeves. Roots grabbed at his shoes. The tapping followed him all the way to the clearing. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. But when he reached the house, the family was waiting, not blocking him, not threatening, standing silently in the doorway, as if greeting someone who had finally come home. He realized then what the valley had always whispered. The family never kidnaps. The family never hunts. The family never forces. People who come too close simply become part of the system. The forest children stepped to the tree line. The house children stood under the porch. Two halves, one cycle, waiting to see which side he would join. He didn't choose. He didn't have to. He did what every person who enters the ridge does. When the system finally recognizes them, he backed away. He returned to his car. He drove out of the valley without looking back. He stopped filming. He stopped speaking. He stopped responding to calls. The footage was found months later, delivered anonymously. No signature, no explanation. Just a single piece of paper attached. Do not return. One visit is enough to change the mind. The last seconds of his final recording show his reflection in a dark window rocking slightly, eyes unfocused, fingers tapping against his chest. Tap, 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 tap. The same pattern. The cycle had accepted him. And he would never speak again.